constantly scramble for funds. This creates inefficiencies and pressures that have contributed to incidents of plagiarism and research fraud that, while thankfully rare, are high profile and undermine trust. On the other hand, in industry, it's patent or perish. More on that in a bit. Of late, pharma has had a crisis of productivity that's caused much hand-wringing, and success was rare even in good times. Too many products lack originality, and now payers are demanding an end to Me Too drugs. Yet pharmas all seem to be working on more or less the same drug targets, maneuvering around each other's patents. Some say because there simply aren't all that many suitable targets in the genome. For a number of reasons, pharma has a serious image problem at a time when the public is increasingly loath to accept R&D spending as a justification for high margins on medicines. Academia publishes and industry patents, and vice versa, of course, in the real world. The domain of intellectual property is techne rather than episteme, procedures rather than propositions, technology rather than nature. We have moral qualms at the thought of patenting nature, genes, for example, and this is the source of at least some of the unease beneath the question, who owns science? The question devolves to how cleanly techne can be separated from episteme, the issue with which the Romantics struggled. Even for techne, there are economists like Michel Boldrin and David K. Levine who question the usual rationale for patents, that they stimulate innovation through the incentive of a temporary monopoly. James Watt, whose steam engine I showed earlier, was embroiled in patent fights for much of his life, which pretty clearly impeded rather than stimulated innovation. Boldrin and Levine make a similar case for pharma. The sentiment is also reflected in recent commons movements, such as the open source software movement, open access publishing, and patent pools. Other trends, academia is increasingly the locus of big science as a result of genome-scale initiatives and institutions. Ironically, at the same time, the pharma industry seems to be in a rush to shed its R&D capabilities due to poor return on investment and to mergers for purposes of cost-cutting. Academia has gotten very businesslike, with aggressive tech transfer functions and more industry sponsorship of research, raising some of the concerns this symposium is addressing. Faculty are active as consultants and advisors to industry, and many aspire to spin off their ideas and create startups. Some see this as encapsulating academia in a kind of industrial framework that diminishes it in significant ways. Meanwhile, pharma is increasingly virtual, not only outsourcing and offshoring key functions, but also coming to depend on in-licensing of drug candidates, often from biotech startups, though generally only after they've ripened quite a bit. To state this model in hugely oversimplified cartoon form, we can assign academia the role of extracting innovation from scientific inquiry, while industry's function is to reduce innovation to practice and commercialize it. The trend is for the myriad good ideas arising in academia to be somehow monetized, in many cases by becoming the basis for spin-off enterprises. Meanwhile, industry is curtailing its internal innovation, creating more of a market for the very few successful startups. However, each of those good ideas has to be encased in corporate trappings and patent fortresses, creating a great churn of economic activity, which can be seen as a virtue, but which I suggest is wasteful overall. The startups come and go with high overheads and latencies associated with creating businesses and absorbing their failures, as compared to the facile turnover of in-house projects. We accept this as free market economics, high reward for high risk, but the cost shows up in the price of medicines. Consider two case histories from the east and west coast of the US, truly the yin and yang of America. On the left, bordering San Francisco Bay, is Silicon Valley, and on the right, on a radius around Boston Harbor, is the Route 128 Ring Road. Both are famous high-tech incubators associated with prestigious universities, Stanford and MIT, respectively. For decades, they nurtured numerous startup companies, many of them engineering faculty spin-offs. The ones on the left have mostly thrived. Those on the right came and went. Why? Well, according to Annalise Saxenian, the companies along Route 128 were a string of castles, closed off, self-sufficient, highly protective of their technology, demanding absolute loyalty of employees. Silicon Valley, though, was deal crazy, highly networked and collaborative. its employees all socialized and moved freely between jobs. The entire valley was a technological syncytium, a virtual consortium and hotbed of innovation. The ill-fated companies on Route 128 were vertically integrated, as are large pharmas, which span the entire process from R&D to manufacturing to distribution and marketing. In fact, R&D is a relatively small spend, and in terms of corporate culture has always been the odd man out. It's the only point where episteme mingles with the techne of making and selling pills. I've already suggested that episteme is admixed with techne in academia as well, but note that there's also a vertical integration on this side of the ledger of a very basic sort. Academia is not only charged with imparting knowledge, but with discovering it as well. This seems to be a very appropriate and successful integration, even if faculty sometimes have trouble achieving a balance. But vertical integration occurs at more than one scale. That is, the research done in academia can be divided into basic research on the one hand, primarily to do with episteme and closest in spirit to the mission of education. And on the other hand, directed research, which tends more to techne and is most associated with support from industry. Now, if the directed research in academia is where most of the issues arise, one approach would be to acknowledge its different nature and segregate it in some fashion that would make those differences more apparent and more manageable. In fact, this approach is very far from novel in academia. Returning to our examples of Stanford and MIT, we find many instances of directed research being spun off. MIT's semi-autonomous instrumentation lab developed inertial navigation and during the war, high-tech gun sights. It went on to create guidance systems for missiles in the Apollo moonshot. Meanwhile, the Stanford Research Institute did diverse contract research after the war. Both were part of their parent institutions, but under pressure from Vietnam-era protesters because of their defense work, were formally divested as inappropriate for academia. MIT's Lincoln Lab still has close ties despite Pentagon funding, and more recently the Whitehead and Broad Institutes have tackled industrial scale biology. SRI does contract research for pharma, among many other clients, and has just opened a center for advanced drug research in Virginia. Notably, when GE acquired RCA in 1986, it found the latter's famous Sarnoff R&D Center in New Jersey to be redundant and simply donated it to SRI for the tax break. Now hold that thought, if you will. Industry divesting R&D to a quasi-academic, nonprofit, directed research institute with no strings attached. Picking up on that pattern, let's go back to consider the vertical integration in pharma. Just as basic and directed research could be segregated in academia, research and development in industry is also very naturally divisible, with research often termed discovery. Discovery and development are treated differently in organizational structures, in operational standards and practices, and even by regulatory bodies. In full development, where pivotal clinical trials are conducted and the majority of R&D budget is spent, the science is medical and highly regulated, while in discovery it's mainly biological and considered exploratory with fewer strictures. Not only the methodologies, but again the cultural differences can be quite marked. If we now break off the outlier in industry, just as we did in academia, what are we left with? What we're left with is the most corporate element of academia, where we've concentrated most of the external investment and the vexing questions about ownership of science and the proper role of the university. In industry, we've isolated the most basic research, that which already seems to be on the chopping block, and is increasingly bypassed by in-licensing straight to development. It's also where many companies' efforts seem to overlap. Note that I don't suggest that this is the only component of pharma that seeks academic interaction, since clinical development is often performed in